Afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the final workshop before the hack begins later this evening. Very excited indeed to be able to bring you Sam Larsen-Disney and his front-end survival guide. So over to you, Sam.
Okay. Hey, everybody. I'm Sam, and I'm a UX engineer at a company called Behavior Lab. Behavior Lab is an interesting company that looks at the bridge between psychology and technology when it comes to decision making in funds. So quite an interesting mix there. Before I get started, I should say that all views expressed in this talk are my own and do not represent the opinions of any entity whatsoever with which I have been, am now, or will be affiliated with. I just want to point out that this is not an ordinary PowerPoint. There's a lot of really interactive elements that I'm hoping to get you guys involved in. So if you go to follow.sld.codes, there should be a nice big banner saying that this presentation is being presented right now. You can follow along. You'll get crystal clear slides as we go through. I'm going to give you just 20 to 30 seconds to head there. You don't actually have to watch me anymore. If you're there at that point, you should be able to follow along on your screen. So we'll just give you a couple of seconds. Cool. There should also be a link in the chat, thanks to Alex. So let's jump into it. So I thought I'd just talk a little bit about my journey. I'm a web developer and have been for kind of, I guess, I don't know, 5-6 years now. I previously worked for American Express on the design language system team, building all sorts of crazy things. If you go to americanexpress.com and click on any button, the code that runs behind that is code that I've written myself. So that's my claim to fame. But I guess the point is, I think for most of you, I'm about 4 to 5 years ahead of you. So hoping I can kind of give you some broad knowledge about web development, about front end, and maybe give you a little bit of background as well. So I thought what we'd do to start is have a look at a little bit of the history. And I'm going to do the quick version because this can get very boring very quickly. But I thought we'd just kind of dive through how the web got started and how we got to where we are today. So the origins of the internet go way back to the 1960s. The US military were the ones who kind of brought it to life with this project called ARPANET, which linked computers together remotely for the first time. And very quickly after that, there was a whole load of really significant milestones that really started to kind of catalyst things along. The first email message was sent by this guy called Ray Tomlinson, who also made the @ symbol a thing. Usenet went live in 1979, and this was a precursor to modern social media and allowed enthusiasts to share memes and descend into obtuse arguments online for the first time. The domain name system, or DNS as some of you might know it, was established in 1983, and .com started becoming a thing in 1985. And then, obviously, the www comes in. So web development as we know it today began with a guy called Tim Berners-Lee. He created something called hypertext text markup language, HTML, in the early 1990s. And this was, what really threw us into the World Wide Web. And HTML still forms the backbone of virtually every web page created. So every web page you visit will be compiled down into HTML. There's also been a whole lot of things around browser wars in the 1990s. So during the early 1990s, the web developer was not recognized as a profession. There were a variety of different roles, such as designer, content manager, and programmer, which kind of all came under this unified term called webmaster. This is one of the first browsers that focused on kind of front-endy stuff called Mosaic, which landed in 1993. And it allowed you to do graphical user interfaces for the first time. This kind of early era introduced the browser wars as competing web browser vendors attempted to outdo each other with the features and quirks and cool extra bits that made their web browsers unique and interesting. And it was around this time that this symbol was really common. That you would go to a site and they were trying to say, like, if you use Microsoft Internet Explorer, then the site's going to look better. But actually, nowadays, Internet Explorer is deprecated, and some massive companies still have to support it, but everyone's on Chrome. So I always find that funny looking at that. So anyway, this made the developers' job very difficult because these browsers were kind of separating out in different directions. So you'd have to build and catch functions in different places so that the page you created looked the same across these different web pages. But luckily, user expectations were not particularly high during this period. Many popular websites were produced by hobbyists, and browsing the web was a bit like browsing the Wild West experience. There were no accepted standards of design and accessibility across the web. It was about this time that you had sites like Space Jam, which actually, this is always used as the example of a really classic 90s website, but they have recently changed it. So if you go and see it, it does not look the same because they're revamping the movie. But I think there is still a link to go and find this old version, and it's worth a look. But this, there was all sorts of weird stuff you had to do to get stuff looking interesting. Like this is, this element being surrounded in a circle was done with innovative solutions like adding GIFs that are blank space in between these items, and grid systems and all sorts of weird stuff that kind of actually made creating layouts like this an absolute nightmare back then. There was also this thing called Macromedia Flash Player, which many of you might have heard of. You might have used Miniclip before, that was full of Flash games, but this was acquired by Adobe and basically made a whole new world of possibilities for developers who were frustrated by the limits of HTML. So you could have a lot of fun creating games and interactive UI elements inside Flash. And it worked slightly differently. So it provided content in the browser as a plugin rather than relying on the browser's features underneath. And this meant you could do animated stuff, interactive content that worked on the majority of users' computers, as it wasn't building on top of a specific browser. However, it also led to some issues. Most users relied on slow modem connections back in those days, and Flash websites could take a really long time to load. Search engines weren't able to correctly land on that site and read what was inside the Flash. So you would not be able to get effective search results for pages like that. It caused difficulties with SEO as a result. Accessibility is a huge thing these days, but it used to be the case that if you were using assistive technology back then, Flash sites were unusable. And even the most simple content updates would require a Flash developer to implement, making these sites very costly to maintain. And it required the plugin to be installed in the first place. And this could also leave like a barrier to entry, which is no fun at all. But then luckily, this man kind of killed that too, because in 2010, with iOS devices, he said that the iPhone would no longer support Flash, and he killed it off with one sentence, which is absolutely incredible. And as we start to think about the 2000s, there was a growing grassroots movement to establish independent standards for web technologies. Groups like the World Wide Web Consortium began to exert influence over the industry in an effort to make the web accessible for all and ensure that advancements were not driven by the profit of individual tech companies. Luckily, this is great for us because gradually browsers and developers began to adopt a standard approach to everything. And this has led to, us being able to do things, write code that works on all browsers and just know that it works. And, open source technology has been a great catalyst for that as well. And there's been a greater emphasis put on the focus of the end user. A major issue with HTML-based websites at this time was that the content and presentational code were all mixed together in one big document. And this made it super difficult for a non-developer to update a website and caused all sorts of maintenance problems. If a company wished to change a brand color, for example, then they would have to ask a developer to go and individually update all the pages wherever the color was used. Absolutely nightmare. So this thing called CSS gradually gained widespread adoption. So we started to add style sheets into the mix. As web browsers moved towards standardization, developers could build more accessible, functional, and performance sites. Content editors could update with confidence, knowing that a wrong move would not completely break the site's layout. In many ways, this made the developer's job easier, but for some, it meant having to learn an entirely new language and process for producing websites. unlearning carefully mastered techniques that had now become obsolete. And then JavaScript became a thing. So JavaScript became the standard language used to add interactivity to web pages. Unfortunately, differences in how web browsers interpret this language made it very challenging to prevent bugs and inconsistencies in the end user experience. There was this thing called Jquery, which I'm not a huge fan of, probably tell by the emoji, but Jquery was a framework that emerged as a wrapper around JavaScript, an attempt to iron out the inconsistencies that were giving developers problems between browsers. And Jquery became an essential part of the front-end developers' toolbox as a result. If we think about where we are today, we have kind of reached the stage where standards have become widely accepted. Internet Explorer is being phased out, yay, and front-end development has become relatively mature. Smartphones and other web-enabled devices have brought a new set of challenges to the forefront of web dev. Creating responsive mobile-first development is kind of the de facto standard practice to address this. Websites are now produced in such a way that user experience is optimized for users on small screens, and additional features are added to enhance the experience on large screens. So think about your small screens first in your hack. Web users now expect a fast, accessible, and seamless experience on whatever device they use to access a site. This has led to a trend for function over Flash in web design and much greater focus on the needs of the end user. Front-end development is no longer about hacking together web pages, so modern user interfaces should provide an app-like experience. Today, developers must adopt best practices from both software engineering and user interface design. But what's cool is it's still an incredibly fast-moving profession with new frameworks and trends emerging all the time. Many of you might have heard of React from Facebook, and that's the hot thing at the moment. But who knows, in 10 years, it could be something else. However, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are still the core technologies that underpin everything that is built to be viewed on the web browser, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. So let's talk about the future a little bit. Web development has changed a lot in terms of the office in the last year and a half, 2 years. So with coronavirus, the office is slowly dying. No one's commuting to work. Everyone's remote working. There's kind of a better work-life balance for some. Some people find the exact opposite and seem to work too hard and don't know when to switch off. But regardless of that, if you're not going to the office, you can live wherever you want. And there's a lot of companies out there who have started to embrace this work from home culture. I know that Twitter, for example, have said that their colleagues don't ever need to come back to the office if they don't want to. You also see companies like Microsoft and Apple saying that they'll allow employees to work remotely going forward as well. And what this might mean is that there's a bit of an exodus from Silicon Valley and other tech hubs like London, where people are moving to these areas specifically for these tech jobs. If tech jobs are remote, there's no need for them to move and they can be where they want. College degrees no longer are required for jobs at these big companies. More and more of them are saying that they'll take you if you don't have a degree, and that's a super interesting change. But what it also means is that the job market is more competitive, as you effectively have to compete with the entire world, because it's no longer based on where you are and it's not based on your degree. So you just got to be the best. So one other really good thing is that our industry performs way better in these weird times than any other fields. Tech continues to expand and has continued to do really well. I mean, just look at how Amazon's taken off, for example, over the last year and a half. It's absolutely insane. It just goes to show that regardless of what is thrown our way, tech's probably going to stick around for a very long time and not see a decline. Just some other personal notes from me. TypeScript, if you haven't heard of it, will continue to dominate, especially with this thing called Dino being a thing. TypeScript is a it's type safe on top of JavaScript. We'll get into it in a little bit because I do want to sidetrack and talk about Dino for any of the nerds that are on here. So what is Dino? Dino is a secure runtime for JavaScript and TypeScript, and it solves some of the problems that Node.js had and was made by the same guy. So there's this Node is the currently most used JavaScript compiler, and basically the guy who built it says that it could have been much nicer. It still uses this V8 JavaScript engine, but it's got a runtime implemented in Rust and TypeScript. and it hit release candidate 1 in 2020. So I would really encourage you to go and have a look at that if you're interested. It's secure by default, and it prevents a whole load of security holes that exist currently in modern JavaScript. Just to give you a little demo of what I mean. If you wanted to print the current working directory that you are in, you wouldn't just be able to do that. You have to actually explicitly say when you run the command, I'm going to allow it to read my files before I can do that. And the same rules apply for other things that I'll get into in a minute, but it also supports this thing called top level await. So if you're fetching data, normally you have to wrap awaits in an async function, but now you don't have to do that anymore. Sorry, this is incredibly nerdy, and I promise I will come back soon. You can start to do stuff that you could only do in the browser, but also in your terminal, which is crazy cool. You can execute WebAssembly binaries, and there's this thing called Npm, which is the Node Package Manager, where everyone submits their JavaScript libraries for use by other developers, but that's gone away with. Instead, you can reference packages from anywhere in the world. So I could host them on this site, for example, if I wanted to. And I think that's really interesting. So when a script is run for the first time, it downloads it and caches it, and then you can use it as you would, but you don't have to have it. You don't have to have a package JSON everywhere across your projects, which is awesome. So it's secure by default, browser compatible, test runners, modules, all this kind of stuff is way better as a result. There's a simple server demo. You should have access to this URL. So if you want to come back and have a look, go for it. Anyway, web apps and native apps will draw nearer each other. So one thing that we seem to see a lot of at the moment is you see that the phone experience and the web experience is looking very, very similar. I often think of like Facebook. You practically have the same app in both cases, which I think leads to people thinking, why am I developing two applications that do the same thing? So you start to see things like React Native and React kind of get very close in terms of how they look. And I think we're going to see that trend go forward. And eventually, you'll write your code once and get a website, but also get an app out of the same code. And that's really, really interesting. You can also do some crazy stuff in the browser with JavaScript that you couldn't in the past. Some of these are specific to Chrome, but they are getting wider and wider spread adoption. So you can do push notifications, offline functionality, Bluetooth, background sync, and all sorts of other stuff inside the browser. If you look these things up, you can do them today with only a few lines of code. There's also WebAuthn. If you click this link and you're watching, it will open a new tab, a demo where you can use Touch ID if you have it to log into a website, which I think is really, really neat. So we'll see more and more of these apps kind of just wrap web pages. You see quite a few of these today, but you open the app on your phone, and instead of having the app entirely coded and built separately, all it is really is a browser that opens the web page of the site that app is associated with. And that actually has a whole load of benefits, because if you want to release an update to the App Store, it can be really difficult. It can take a long time, and there's a whole lot of review process you have to go through with Apple engineers. But to update your website, you can do that in a fraction of a second. And if all they're doing is loading up that website inside your app, then you can push updates whenever you want. Also, artificial intelligence will not take your job, at least at the moment. There's quite a lot of stuff going around with this thing called GPT-3, and also there's like people can describe applications and then it will spit out some code that does the thing, but it's not nearly as advanced as you might think it is. So don't panic. However, what might change our jobs quite a bit is this no-code, low-code revolution. You might have heard of tools like Webflow that's advertised a lot. So there's a lot of tools out there to help those with no coding experience create apps. There's a link to Webflow right here, but it won't take your job. I think the main thing that it will do is just allow us to change where we focus. So currently they can do very simple static pages, kind of submission forms for emails and stuff like that. But if your website is any more complex than that, you're going to need a developer to help you out. And basically, we'll be able to solve those complex problems going forward and spend less time doing the more mundane, dull stuff. And it means that we'll be able to follow an even more dry principle Dry being don't repeat yourself. There's also this idea that the server is dead and it's expensive. So when you want to start a web app project, quite often you decide that you want to host it somewhere and you buy server space. There's all sorts of platforms like Heroku that allow you to do this if you're interested, but you normally rent these out for a month at a time, and they can be expensive, keeping a server running all the time when the demand for your site sometimes might be very low or might be very high. And one thing that kind of circumvents this issue or gets around it is this idea of serverless. And serverless works very similar to a server, but different. So serverless computing, or serverless for short, is an execution model where the cloud provider, so AWS or Google Cloud, is responsible for executing a piece of code that you give it, but it dynamically allocates the resources for that. And it only changes the amount of resources you need based on the runs of the code. So say you were spending £7 on Heroku a month to run your site. If you switched it to serverless and you only had a few hundred users, you probably could be paying pennies instead of pounds. So you can imagine as that scales up, you can save yourself an absolute ton of money by investing in serverless. And serverless is arguably far easier to set up. When you're thinking about your hackathon, if you're interested in trying some of this stuff, Firebase is a really great place to start with serverless. They have cloud functions that are awesome, and they've got some great documentation too. There's also serverless databases. So also in the Firebase space, there's Firestore that allows you to do this, but the idea that you can have a similar deal where you don't need to have a database running the whole time can save you a ton of money. And with technologies like this, we're going to spend less time thinking about how we scale, and it will just work out of the box. But what is in the box of a modern web page? Well, as we've previously said, HTML, which stands for the hypertext markup language. Every web page in the world is HTML, and it's the main thing that web browsers understand. HTML describes the page contents as a series of elements. You've got CSS, so a style sheet to define the style of elements directly. You can change different predefined properties of things. And then, of course, we've got the beautiful JavaScript, named that way, by the way, to appeal to Java developers. So when it first came out, they wanted to try and steal some of the Java market, so they called it JavaScript. However, it doesn't really work like JavaScript. Sorry, like Java. But it allows us to implement the complex features on web pages that we want to have, so kind of dynamic functionality. So I thought I would get practical with you guys and introduce you to two modern industry-leading front-end technologies. I thought I'd look at React with you and Gatsby. So let's just start with NPM. I touched on it earlier, but NPM stands for Node Package Manager. And it is a package manager for the JavaScript programming language. It's the default package manager for the JavaScript runtime environment. It consists of a couple of things: command line client, also called NPM, an online database of public and paid packages, JavaScript packages, called the NPM registry. And the registry is accessed via the client, and you can basically download any packages you want. When thinking about functionality you want to include in your hacks, just search out there if there's an NPM package that already does it, because chances are there are, and you can pull that into your project and save yourself some time. There is a company, NPM, that sits behind NPM. I know, so meta, that basically runs the package manager. It also allows users to consume and distribute JavaScript modules that are available on the registry. There are over 1 million packages. So I'm telling you, you're going to find stuff that can make your life far easier if you go and start browsing NPM. Every website you build using NPM contains something called a package JSON and a node modules folder. And package JSON is what I like to think of as a shopping list. So it contains the list of all the packages you've pulled from NPM. And what happens is that when you start your project, you'll pull in the information from that package JSON to go and download those packages that you're using, and they get stored in something called a node modules folder, which sits inside the repository too. Important to note that you should never commit that to Git, because what you'll find is that that folder gets really big really quick. And if you're on a Mac and you have iCloud enabled, you start having gigabytes lost just to node modules folders. And I still haven't found a solution. I've been trying to fix it for weeks. Cool. So let's say you wanted to install a package like React, for example. You would install Node first, and then you can run npm wherever you want. So you can npm install React. If you are viewing this and you just want to answer this question for me, have you used React before? Let's see if we get some people answering this or not. I'll try and pitch it at a different level if you haven't used React before. Okay, maybe not. Cool. Well, let's assume we'll start with the very, very basics then. The very, very basics. React is a declarative library for building user interfaces. A library, not a framework. So it's something that enhances your existing code, but it doesn't care about your folder structure. These are functions you can use, and you just take them and you go, as opposed to being told that you have to do things in a certain way. It's declarative. And kind of just to try and explain that, let's take the example of you're in your car and you want to turn up the AC. In an old car, you would use a dial to turn up the temperature yourself until you're at the right temperature. This is kind of like Jquery. You would grab the element in the DOM, get the text value, and set the element to the new value in the browser. But React is more like a Tesla. You set the exact temperature that you want, and then the car then decides whether you need to make it cooler or warmer. I just wanted it X degrees, and it just does it. Me as a user doesn't need to worry about that, and I can focus on kind of how I want the larger picture to look like, and it will worry about the details of what parts of the application need to change. So let's dive into some code. React itself is kind of like a blueprint, and React DOM uses that blueprint to make the user interface. So this is the most basic of React apps. So you would import React, import the DOM, and then you would render. We're just rendering a div with the word hello in it at the moment on the root element of the HTML. What if I want to use the same code to build mobile UIs? Well, there's this thing called React Native, and it looks incredibly similar. Same difference, pretty much. And I would encourage you to look at React Native too if you want to build mobile experiences. For your first hackathon, this might scare you a little bit, and I'd suggest you focus on web. But both are really, really interesting libraries. And if you're seeing this for the first time, you might be thinking that I'm putting HTML in JavaScript, and that's insane. But it's important to know that this is not HTML. This is something called JSX, which I like to think of as like JavaScript Extreme. It's a templating language that looks a bit like HTML, but isn't. So you can also start to kind of abstract this out. So here I'm saying, let the React root element equal this value that I've made before, and then I just rendering it out, and we can start to abstract it even further. So this is exactly the same thing. Some people prefer this the way it looks, but it's really personal preference. You can see there that that's the div property, and then we've got the children hello as the third argument in that function. And you could even get more abstract than that. So you can see I'm now pulling out the text that I want to put into the line above. And we can keep going. So here we've actually got a function that is returning the children that we want to put into the browser, which is insane. And you can even have a React.create element inside a React.create element. And the more you do this, the grosser it gets. Or you could just use that thing called JSX that I was talking about before. And hopefully this kind of makes sense. So here we had this before. This React element that created some text, and inside that text, you've got a whole lot of exclamation marks. We could have just written that as the line below it, and it would do the exact same thing. Same deal with buttons. We can switch this out for a button. So any HTML element that you're used to using, you can use inside JSX just fine. And then once you've defined that, what's great is it's reusable, right? So we can, for example, define this button component that uses an HTML button and has some text in it. And then we could render them as many times as we like, and you'd get 4 buttons on the screen, for example, in this case. And at this point, let's start looking at how this might look. So here I've got 3 buttons inside this div. if you're watching, you can edit this code, by the way. But you can start to have a play, and you'll get more and more buttons the more you have a go with this. You can also change the text. So cool. So let's talk about props a little bit. Props is this idea of passing down things to your different components. So you might be able to see here that I've got this button component, and I'm telling it there's some props coming in, and I'm telling it that inside those props it's going to find a value called text. And then what I want it to do is inside a button, put that text. So you can see down here, I've got this text equals Sam, and you can see there it's added Sam in there. You can have a go yourself and add text to that button, edit the text, or add text to the buttons below it, and you should start to see them update. So also we can do a very similar thing where we can kind of add a prop called onClick, which means that when you click that button, I want you to do something. So if you click this button here, it will give you an alert in the browser saying that the button says, hey, because what I've done is I've added an onClick event and I've told it to alert. It doesn't have to be called onClick though. You can call it whatever you want. Say fish and pass it in as a prop, and as long as it's on that HTML element as an onClick, then it will just magically work, which is awesome. There's also this idea of something called state. It's no good to have a button if you don't save the result of you clicking that button somewhere. So let's, for example, take a like button and use that. You can use this idea of something called state in React. There's a great hook called the use state hook, and that gives you two values, two items. It gives you a value of what that state looks like at that moment in time, and it gives you a function to update it. So you can see here I've got a likes, and I've got a function to increase the likes. And when I click this button, I tell it to increment the likes. And what this does is it runs that set state and increases the likes by the current number of likes added by 1. So if you hit that button below, we should start to see the likes rise. Similarly, you could do the exact same thing and have a decrement likes. Exactly the same deal, except when we increase likes, we now increase it by the number of likes minus 1. And that then gets us going the other way. So we can add likes and we can remove likes. But right now we can go backwards and actually have a negative number of likes, which is really no good. So instead, what we do is we start to have conditionals. So you can say here, I can only decrement the likes if the likes is greater than 0. If it's not greater than 0, then you can't run it. So if I hit remove like now, it's no good. You get the idea. Cool. We can also start to, hear, we can start to have some fun with errors as well. So if we remove likes and the likes is greater than 0, then maybe we could have another state value that handles errors. So we could set errors. So for example, right here, I'm using the marquee, which is deprecated and you shouldn't use it, but also it looks hella funny. So yeah, you can have a play with that, and you can have loads and loads of different state objects working together to kind of perform the functionality that you want. I've been talking for a really long time, so I thought I would stop here for a break. I've given you a ton of information. If there are questions and you're on the presentation, you can ask me directly. Otherwise, if you're watching via YouTube, I'm sure Alex will feed me any questions if there are any.
Yeah, I was going to say just a really quick one. We had from Ravi right at the start, I think, while we see if another few filter through. Just which open source no code mobile app platform would you advise using for the hackathon to link up front end UI with a back end that connects to APIs to pull data into the front end?
I think it depends on what you mean by app and mobile app, because if I would say that any web application that you can access via Safari or via on your mobile phone is just as adequate as making like a native app on the phone. I would suggest that doing it natively on the phone is way harder to do, especially in your first hack, especially if you're going through the no code route. There are platforms out there that allow you to do it. I know that Flutter's not bad, but I would still suggest maybe using something like Webflow to do it as more of a web experience, because they have more integrations with backend services that you would then be able to use. So Webflow would probably be my go-to. Got another question on the slide decks. Would you advise to install packages individually rather than Create React App? So Create React App is an awesome place to start. If you haven't used React before and you want to just kind of jump into coding, Create React App that this person is asking me about is a really good thing to start with if you want to Google it, and it will give you the basics. However, there's a whole load of stuff that it skims over that you don't learn as a result of doing it. It really depends on where you want to focus your time. If you want to focus your time on just designing the pages, linking things together, and thinking about the functionality of your app, then absolutely Create React App works well. But if you want to create an experience during your hackathon where you also learn a lot about the underlying functionality, then maybe using Create React App is not the best way, and maybe you should start from more of the fundamentals. Can we pull out the actions so that they are not coded in the button elements for dry purposes? 100%. So in the example I had back here, I had on clicks all over the shop. You could start to abstract these out further, especially if you're seeing repeated. If you had lots of different buttons with the same on click, you could definitely pull that logic out. Cool. It's good that this person is thinking about dry as well. Dry is super principle to kind of nail in as soon as you can, and try not to write any more code than you absolutely have to. Are there any more questions on your side, Alex, or shall I keep going?
There don't seem to be any more filtering through. I think if anyone has any, yeah,
There's
just
another
pop them in the
Q&A
chat.
session later. So
Yeah.
awesome. Cool. Let's talk about this thing called Gatsby. Didn't get many results on this last time, but I'll try again. Who has used Gatsby before? Have you used Gatsby before or not?
I think with this as well, Sam, there's just like a little bit of a delay between the feed and the slides as well. So there may be a few people voting. I know on the YouTube chat we had 4 yeses for React and 2 nos.
Okay,
so yeah,
cool.
I'll put the poll on YouTube as well.
I'm hoping Gatsby, a few of you had a Gatsby. If you haven't, that's great. The more of you haven't, I'm going to change your life right now, because if you like React, Gatsby's also awesome and built on top of it. Okay, I'm seeing a few votes. So what is Gatsby JS? I like to think of it like this. You get simplicity by finding slightly more sophisticated building blocks. And that's a quote from a guy called Alan Kay. But what Gatsby really is a static site generator. So you produce static HTML files at the end. You put those out onto a server, and then when someone requests a page, they instantly get the result, and there's no query done on the server side. It's all built, pre-built at build time, and then posted somewhere. You can put it on a CDN, which speeds it up even further. But one thing, when I say static, I don't mean that you have to have a static page with no dynamic content. You can still add all the JavaScript you want and make dynamic experiences. It's got this wonderful idea of using GraphQL underneath. If you already know a bit of React, like some of you said in the poll, then I would suggest you try Gatsby out, because you might learn some GraphQL at the same time. But what it does is it uses GraphQL to get data from anywhere. So they have this massive ecosystem of plugins. You can source data from databases, from files locally, from pretty much any source you can imagine, and then pull it in, and you can pull it in ahead of time. So when you're building your pages, and then it doesn't need to query for data when the user asks for it. So it's far faster. In fact, this slide deck is Gatsby. And I'm not going to go into huge detail right now, because I will in a little bit, but this is built using Gatsby, and hopefully I'm hoping that you're experiencing quite a fast website. So this is the underlying tech that's powering what you're seeing. So Gatsby generates pages for you. You pass Gatsby this content through the GraphQL layer, you define a template in React, and it will create pages for you. And Gatsby uses a Node.js server to do this in development, but in production, it's just compiled down to static. That might sound really, I don't know, a little bit scary to a lot of you, but you don't have to handle the server yourself. You run one command and Gatsby will do the rest for you. It's built with this plugin architecture that I talked about before. And this is another really useful thing, much like NPM. There are a whole load of developers out there who have built plugins that integrate with all those data sources you want to use. So you have a database set up somewhere, you can pull from that probably with 1 to 2 lines of code because someone's written a plugin that will allow you to link to it, which means that you can focus on what's important, the design and the flow of your application. It harnesses React.js. So if you knew React before and you want to try something new, this is probably the thing for you. So you can use React and style sheets to help structure your page layout, create templates and components, and it will all work just the same as it did before. But the one difference here is that Gatsby is a framework and not a library. So unlike a library, this Gatsby will enforce a folder structure on you. So you have a bit of a project structure that looks like this. I'm going to start in the middle with the Gatsby Config.js. This is like the core configuration file for Gatsby, and it's where you have the list of all your plugins and how they interact and any site metadata you might have. There's a Gatsby node file that controls your site's data in the GraphQL data layer. And then there's a Gatsby browser where you can put code that you specifically want to run on the client's browser. There's also a static file. So maybe you want to have a few images on your site that are statically served up, a favicon for your site, that kind of thing. You can put that in there and it will get copied across to your public folder when it's built. Templates is where you write React components that get turned into pages more than one time. So let's imagine you have a blog. If you write a blog post, you don't want to have to create the template for your blog post every single time. You might just want to define it once and then use it 12 times. And that's what templates does. So it really helps you with that dry principle. You have a pages folder, and that's where you define React components that just create pages one time. So for example, let's say you have an About Me page on the site, you might have a file in there called about.js, which just has a React component in it that looks like a regular React component with a heading one that says About Me, for example, and then that will get turned into a page at /about because the file name is about.js. Pretty neat stuff. If you are interested in local development of plugins, you have a plugins folder as well, but that's totally not necessary. And then you have a public folder, which you don't build or create yourself, but when you build your application, the public folder contains the output. So it's got the raw HTML, JavaScript, and CSS that will create your site. And that's the bit that you deploy for people to view your application. So let's look inside that Gatsby config file. Quite often what you'll do is you'll specify some site metadata. So you'll put some stuff in that you might want to use across multiple pages, like the title of your site, what the website address is, and then you can start to define some plugins. So here I've got 2 plugins. I've got a source file system plugin, which, as the name might suggest, it sources files from my system. And I've said that I've got some blog posts in a /content/blog folder. And then I've got a plugin underneath called Gatsby Transformer Remark. And what that does is it takes markdown files, which is what my blog posts were written in, and converts them into a format that Gatsby can understand and ingest in its GraphQL data layer, and then we can use on our pages. So now, with just that, you actually have, assuming you had some blog posts in that folder, you could start creating pages really easily. So the first thing you would need to do is query for those files. And you can do this in GraphQL, but you can say, I want to grab all the markdown where the type in the front matter is article, and I just want to list all the titles. And that's what this code will do. It will go and grab the title of each. If you haven't experienced GraphQL before and it's scaring the hell out of you, don't let it. It's actually a really, really simple structure to understand if you come from a JavaScript world where you're used to JSON. You also have, in that Gatsby Node.js folder, you could start to have defined a blog post component, and then using a very similar process, we could be querying those blog posts in Markdown and then creating a page using that component and the data from this query. As you can start to combine the data and the templates together. And this is literally like this could be a single instance page. There's nothing to stop you writing just regular React code, and it will just it will just work as a standalone page. You don't have to do anything special with it. So I just wanted to quickly jump into why you might want to use Gatsby if you're familiar with React already. One thing is speed. It's super hard to beat sending static output. When you use React, normally you make a request that has to do some thinking, decide what to send you, render it, send it back to you. This method, all the roots of what the user wants have already been predefined. So they request something, you don't have to think, you just send it straight back. So it's way faster. Security is also a massive one. If all you're doing is sending them HTML and it's already generated, there's no communication back the other way. So it's extremely secure. They can't really hack something static. And the last thing is developer experience. If you want to look at the nicest docs in the world, go and have a look at Gatsby JS. They have awesomely written docs that really go into every intricacy of detail that you could want, as well as having some really friendly ones to help you get started. It also gets rid of a whole little logic that you might have come across if you've used React before, like React Router, progressive image loading, and data fetching. It can handle that and abstract it away, so you don't have to worry about it. And as I've said before, you can focus on what matters, which is the flow of your application and how it looks. So it's a modern dev environment, simple tooling, modern and clean language, and it's growing super fast. They have a solid team. There's a whole load of people contributing to it on open source, and as I've said before, the docs are awesome. You can see up until 2020, it was just rising, and that trend has continued. It keeps going up. The official React docs are built with Gatsby. There's a whole load of other examples there if you want to check them out. And if you want to have a go yourself, I also have a few boilerplates I've made, but there's also a really good Gatsby Hello World starter that is also a really good place to start. So try those out. I thought as well, I would jump into a little bit of UX design because why not? You guys will probably have to do some over your hack. So what is UX? UX stands for user experience, and it's the process of creating products that provide meaningful and personally relevant experiences. And the job of a UXer can change day to day, but some of the things you might be doing is creating user personas, conducting research, worrying about information architecture, user flows, creating prototypes, and doing user testing. And I think every front-end engineer should be a UX ambassador because there's a lot of roles out there where you are a front-end engineer and you don't have a UX designer behind you, and you have to make a lot of design decisions yourself. And as a result, and probably in the hack too, right? You're going to be making design decisions all the time, so it's important to try and have your UX hat on as well. So it boils down to creating with your users in mind. So I thought I'd just jump through a few things that you might want to think about. The 5-second rule. So visitors should be able to tell what your site has to offer within the first 5 seconds of landing on your homepage. This is the average time users need to form a first impression and decide whether it's worth engaging with your content. To retain visitors, a landing page must clearly convey its purpose, what content is on offer, and a strong call to action. Most web traffic will come from an external link, such as like a search engine or site links, rather than from users who explicitly know your URL. As a result, users are likely to land on your website with a specific goal in mind, and your site should be able to satisfy that goal by providing engaging, relevant, and valuable information. It's also likely that users who are directed to your site from another source will land on a deeper page of your website. Therefore, all website pages need to be designed to clearly communicate what information can be found there to avoid high bounce rates. A bounce rate is when someone lands on your site and then immediately jumps off because it's not what they're after. And while I'm saying web everywhere, these same principles can be applied to apps as well. Try and keep the design minimal. The information users are looking for on your site needs to be presented in a clean and simple way. If any element of the page doesn't need to be there, get rid of it. In terms of copy, try and keep it smaller. People don't like looking at massive blocks of text. If you can do it in one line, do it in one line. Try and be consistent. And this kind of goes to a number of things. Keep your design consistent across your pages. So for example, if you have the main menu up in the top corner, make sure it's always in the top corner and doesn't jump to the bottom. Think about your brand colors. Keep it consistent across the site. If you're using blue on one page and pink on the next, people might actually start to question whether they're still on the same website or not, which is not the best. So a consistent design enables your users to learn how to navigate your site quickly and effectively, and also gives them a sense of uniformity and familiarity. Try and use some standard design patterns. So design the layout and navigation for a website kind of normally is like a tried and tested things. So if you go to a lot of websites, they always have it at the top. They always have the menu here. They always have a button here. Try and follow those same principles, because if it works for them, it's going to work for you. And obviously, as you're building your applications from scratch at a hack, you don't want to have to waste any time on stuff that you don't need to waste time on. Think about the structure of your content. So the information you put on your website needs to be arranged and grouped into pages that make sense. And it will help you form the navigation of your website or app if you start to think about which content will be displayed where. Calls to actions or buttons should also prompt users to scroll through to uncover more information. You don't have to put it all on one screen and overwhelm them. It's really important that you don't initially think that you know what your users need. It's always good to go and try and ask them or get them to try what you're building in kind of like a prototype form so that they can kind of help you understand their need as much as possible. Also, one quick trick with that is users spend most of their time on other sites. This means that users prefer your site to work the same way as all the other sites they already know. So if there's something similar out there, maybe start with that as well. AKA copy, or at least get inspired by these other sites. Color theory. The colors that we use on our applications and as in personal branding and all sorts actually really matter. All sorts of different colors invoke different emotions in different people, but there are some that are generic kind of, you can blanket statement and say that red people associate with danger. So don't have a button that means go being red. And it sounds crazy, but you see it everywhere on the web where people haven't used the right color schemes. And if your whole application is red, you don't want the person judging your hack to think, oh, I don't know, but this feels like there's a bit of a warning here or something. And use it tastefully or when you need to, but just be careful with colors and just have a look at this and do your research. Also, it's important to note that, and I always find this interesting, but favorite colors differ between men, women, and all sorts of genders. So it's important to go and do your research on that. I always find it strange that orange is hated, and I love orange. Anyway, you can also cheat your color scheme. There's this awesome website called Coolers that I recommend you go and check out. You can give it 1 or 2 hex values, and it will generate a theme based off that for you that you can use across your application. So you don't even have to worry about it. So just worry about your primary and secondary color and let this handle the rest for you. If you're going to put a logo on your design, there's all sorts of ways you can come up with a logo. My SLD logo that I have on this site came from Snake 2, the game on the old Nokia brick phone. And it was kind of that combined with the Netflix ribbon that gave me the SLD logo. And then obviously once you have your logo, try it out in a myriad of colors until you find something that works and fits what you're trying to do. But also remember that your logo has to scale. You'll see it's got to fit in the corner as a favicon, still be legible at that small size, kind of 16 by 16 pixels, as well as at 500 pixels, for example. Just keep that in mind. It's also got to work in black and white. If you have time and you're trying to get things a little bit more flashy, also you can animate stuff. There's a really cool library from Airbnb called Lottie that I highly encourage you to go and check out. It's super performant in the browser, and you can use, there's a website called Lottie Files, which has a whole load of animations that you can use if you decide that's your kind of thing. If you're looking for inspiration, Sidebar's a great daily newsletter that has a whole lot of design links. Dribble and Pages.xyz have a whole lot of examples of websites that designers have come up with, and UpLabs has a whole lot of design files that you can go and take for free and build off of. Think about your content. Writing text to get your users to do what you think is harder than you think. So make it enticing. Don't do this. And when building the site, build it with the tools you want to use in your day job. I mean, you're at a hackathon, you're here to have fun, but if you can learn something that's useful going forwards, whether that's React or whatever you think is going to work best, then give it a go, because you've got free reign. Think about your architecture and just start with the smallest version you can. For example, this website that you're looking at right now was started as just Gatsby analytics and some Markdown, and now it looks like this. But it's still been expanded out from that smallest model. So yeah, go small and then start going big, and then obviously test. You can do something called guerrilla testing, which is where you just go and grab a mate. I don't know if you're living with housemates, but get them to try out your product and have a go. I always like showing this picture because this is from my time at American Express. We used to do user testing with our customers. So that's a card member on the other side of this CSI one-way mirrored glass. And you can see on one side, we've got the phone with them looking at the product, and on the right we can actually see their face, and then we're kind of examining how they use that tool. And you can do the exact same thing. You don't need the one-way mirrored glass, but just the point is that you can see here we're not actually interacting with them directly. We're stepping back, we're looking in, but we're kind of not interrupting them, because what you think your users want or how they'll use it will differ from how they actually will use it. And one last piece of advice is that you're at a hackathon, you're being judged, so if you can't demo it well, don't build it. And if you've tested it, you can have some peace of mind. And then I guess I thought, the last bit I would go into is kind of this idea of JavaScript experiments. I'm a big fan of trying to prove that you can do a lot in the browser that you didn't think was possible. So this presentation, for example, and this whole site was built with tech I've talked about today. This is React and Gatsby with one little extra thing, sockets. And sockets are really, really cool. So a socket is a bi-directional communication channel between a client and a server. So let's say you ordered something off Uber Eats or Deliveroo or one of those services. You stay on the same page and you get updates saying that your food is in the kitchen, that it's on the way, etc. All of that is being handled with sockets. So it's all about real-time updates. This is a super small demo with sockets, but for those who are interested in doing this in React, there's Socket.io client. That's an npm package that you can install that will allow you to do this in React applications. Basically, all I'm doing here is emitting a message to the server saying hello. And on the server in this io.on connection, I'm saying, when I get a message, just console log it. And we can kind of expand out on this, and we will in a second, but you can also store this data, so you can combine it with something called Redux. I'm really conscious that I don't want to overwhelm you, but there's all sorts of crazy technologies you can use. There's code demos throughout here, so I'm going to skim over these, but if you are interested in this technology, come and have a look, because they are worth a look. But what this is doing is allowing you to store data that's coming from a socket or bringing it back inside a React application using Redux. You can also emit messages back from the server to the client. So if they send a message saying hello, you can send a message back saying hello, or doing something first, doing some useful functionality, and then returning a result to the client. And in this presentation, for example, I'm controlling the slide delivery to the viewers who are using the web via sockets as well. So what I'm doing is, whenever the presentation slide changes on my end, I send a change pos on server, which stands for change presentation position on server, with the current index, which matches the index of the slide in the URL bar you'll see at the top. And this then gets sent to the server, and the server then emits an action to everybody else connected, and says, okay, you need to update your presentation index to match where Sam is. And that's kind of how that's working. But one thing you might realize is that based on that, anyone anywhere on my site would get navigated to the page, and I don't want to do that if you're not currently following this presentation. So I have like a little check to check that you're actually in the same slide deck as me, and go one step further, because obviously I don't want you all being able to jump the slides. So I have another check that checks whether the person presenting is me or not. There's a little password prompt I had at the front. But you can have lots of fun with this kind of stuff. Sockets are really, really cool technologies. So kind of just like an overview is that I send a change, and then everybody connected to it that isn't me gets notified via the server. Um, you might also be wondering what happens if I'm going too fast. Well, you can hit the little padlock in the corner and then you can navigate at your own pace, which is pretty neat. And then I only jump if your padlock is locked. Um, and this is actually really, really interesting because if say I am sharing my screen for the purpose of the YouTube video, but imagine I didn't, and I was just on an audio call with you guys, and you were all on this website. Then I wouldn't have to share my video, and sharing HD video uses about 2.5 gigabytes for an hour. Uh, Sharing audio only is 70 megabytes, but using this solution, if I wasn't showing my screen, would be around 90 megabytes. So it's a crazy saving on bandwidth, which is cool, really cool. And you can actually get even stupider with this. I went to a conference called Half Stack. If you like JavaScript and you want to meet some nerds like me who do all sorts of weird, wacky stuff, Half Stack's a great conference to attend. There was a lady called Charlie speaking there, and she introduced the concept of the PostNet skeleton. PostNet is an awesome library from Google that uses ML in TensorFlow to work out where your body is on your webcam. And when I first saw this, I was like, that's insane. And I suddenly thought, well, when people are speaking, they like to gesture with their hands a lot. So I had this crazy idea. Maybe when I'm presenting my slide deck, I'll make it so that when I gesture left or gesture right, it will make the slides go forward or backward. So just give you a super quick demo of how this looks. And again, you can npm install PostNet and use it inside JavaScript projects in React. But basically, it grabs a copy of your video, and then every time it notices a pose, it updates it in an array. And the elements in that array look something like this. It says it's got all the key points of your body. So your left wrist, your right wrist, for example, and a position of where they are on the screen. And then it's got a confidence score as well. And you can use this information to basically say, if I'm gesturing right, based on where my left and right wrist are, or if I'm gesturing left, same deal, then we can jump the presentation position on the server backwards or forwards. And what you end up with is something that looks a little bit like this. So gesturing forward or backward changes the slides. There's also a really interesting piece of tech out there called the Neurosity Crown that is really expensive, but I think it's where the future's going. It's a device you can put on your head and it will monitor your brain waves, and you could throw that into a machine learning model and based on what you're thinking, change presentation positions on slides or do something else. Equally interesting. So yeah, there's a video on that if you want to check it out. Cool, and you can also try this out yourself if you want to go have a look at PostNet. There's a link just there. In terms of this project for me, further extensions I'm thinking about is making it more work better with SEO, maybe have it peer-to-peer. So one person logs on over there, I'm over here, and we just present us two without sharing with everybody. If I could make it so that you could call through this application, I wouldn't even have to join the Zoom or the WebEx call. And then I have this other crazy idea with sockets about making devices harmonize by sending them different pieces of music and getting them to play at the exact same moment. So those are kind of some of the crazy things you can do with sockets if you are so inclined. Cool. Well, on that note, I'm pretty much done. So I don't know if there are Q&A questions for me or stuff you'd like me to go into in more detail. Happy to answer anything at all. So let me know, Alex, if there's any more questions on the YouTube side.
I was going to say, I'll let you know if any stream through from YouTube. Obviously, you've got your Q&A session here. I think there were quite a few people who, on the YouTube chat, as well as your vote, were in the What's Gatsby category. So hopefully you have just changed a few lives. And I know that you mentioned TensorFlow there, and that came up in Cisco's AI session yesterday as well. So yeah, the gesturing stuff's super cool. So yeah, if you have any questions around any of that, or yeah, sockets, anything that Sam's gone through, then let us know.
Yeah, and also if not now and you want to reach out to me, in the middle of your hack, feel free to. I'm around.
And not a question, but just for you, Sam. Young Lee on the chat said, honestly, the best presentation they've seen for a while.
Thank
So
you.
if that's not a glowing endorsement that you can take away, then I don't know what is.
Well, hopefully I didn't blow too many minds. I appreciate there's a lot of techno babble in there, and for people who are more low code and sorry, no code, then I completely understand that a lot of it might have gone over your head. But hopefully you learned a thing or two, or maybe got inspired to try something new.
And
Um,
can you share your GitHub? That's a question that we've had.
yes. So if you are on SLD, yeah, I can share my GitHub. Do you want me to put that? How would you like that sent to you, Alex?
If you just put it in this WebEx chat, then I can put it on the YouTube.
Okay, all right. I can do that. How do I get back into the WebEx chat without stopping the? Okay, here we go. Okay, that's the GitHub. If you're on sld.codes, you can see all my projects on there too. There's some nice one-day kind of stuff if you want to have a go at kind of making a one-day build with Gatsby or React. There's some interesting stuff there. I also started a. If I just, I don't think I have anything else in this presentation to show off. So I just wanted to point out before I do leave it, if you navigate to this slide deck, there's a whole load of links at the end of it, just with related to this whole deck. So if you want to check that out, feel free. I'll send that link to you too, Alex. There you go. If you navigate to sld.codes and are interested in trying some of this stuff out, I have a Hackathons toolkit. And inside it, just for UX designers at the moment, there's a whole lot of links of how you can get started with UX. So maybe while you're having a go with some of this stuff, you could maybe have a look at those links and maybe they'll help you out. Cool. I've sent that to you as well, Alex. Okay.
Perfect.
Awesome. Were there more questions on your end, or was that?
There don't seem
it?
to be any questions. There don't seem to be any questions. I think, like you say, we've got our Discord server and things. So if anyone thinks of any, either during the hack or before, or like they say, they're inspired to go away with an idea, then let us know, either Sam or ourselves on Discord, and we'll make sure to get it answered for you. But a massive thanks to you, Sam. Like we said in
No,
the comments, it was a great talk. I think everyone's enjoyed it. I've certainly learnt something, even though I would be in that no to low code category you mentioned. I certainly enjoyed it. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and thank you, Sam.
you're welcome. Happy hacking, everybody. Bye.